Thank you to Rachel and the Bulletin for organizing this timely program. And I want to extend a warm welcome to everybody that's joined us today from near and far. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with two brilliant experts on climate and nuclear affairs, whose full bios are in the description, and I won't read out in the interest of time, but Sherri Goodman chairs the board of the Council on Strategic Risks, and Jamie Kwong is a fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And so before I turn it over to the speakers and get into the conversation, just a couple of very brief framing comments. So nuclear technologies and climate change both threaten humanity. But today's conversation is rooted in a further key concept, which is that nuclear and climate phenomena are woven together, part of the same fabric. And so what I'm hoping for Sherri and Jamie to help us with today is to pull on two distinct but related threads of that fabric. One, how might climate change undermine nuclear deterrence and make the use of nuclear weapons more likely? In other words, climate change is a threat multiplier and an accelerator of conflict. So what might this mean in countries or regions with a nuclear dimension? And two, climate change has created a global decarbonization imperative. And nuclear power has regained prominence in policy debates about how to move away from fossil fuels and alleviate energy poverty. Yet, bringing about a more nuclearized world would create critical challenges that require leadership and policy development to manage safely. So Sherri, I'm hoping to start with you. At COP28, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, just at the end of last year, some 24 countries announced plans to triple global nuclear capacity by mid-century. But interestingly, the declaration also cites UN Sustainable Development Goal number 7 for clean and affordable energy and nuclear's role in bringing that about. So I'm hoping you can start us off by describing a bit about the relationship between the SDGs and climate and nuclear policy.
Okay, Theo, thank you so much. And thank you to the Bulletin, to Rachel Bronson, to Hallie Posner, also Jamie, delighted to have a sort of next-gen fellow who's also spent some time at the Council on Strategic Risk Center for Climate Security. And Theo, also thank you for your leadership across this space. You've worn many hats, and so have I. So perhaps for those of you who don't know me, I'll just start with a bit of a background, because in many ways this subject brings my life full circle. I started out in the early part of my career as the professional staff member on the Senate Armed Services Committee responsible for oversight of nuclear weapons programs in the United States. And during that era, I both oversaw the production of fissile materials, but also the closure of most of our facilities for environment, safety, and health lapses during the 1980s. And from that emerged the Environmental Management, Environment, Safety, and Health, and Defense Nuclear Facility Safety Board, and many other programs to improve the safety operation of nuclear materials production and management. So, and from there, I later became the first Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Environmental Security. And in that capacity, I oversaw the Department of Defense Environment, Energy, Safety, and Health programs. And during the period of the 1990s, the US military really went from being seen as an environmental laggard to an environmental and clean energy leader at the forefront of environmental stewardship. The next decade, in the 2000s, I founded the CNA Military Advisory Board, which was the first group of generals and admirals to address the national security implications of climate change. And that's where the term threat multiplier emerged from our first report in 2007, National Security and the Threat of Climate Change. It's also the title of my book that will be out later this year, and I hope I'll have a chance to come back and talk with you all about that. And in that context, we recognize that climate change acts as an accelerant for instability in fragile regions of the world, and that it would affect even stable regions. And we see that now very vividly over the last decade with fires, floods, extreme weather events, Arctic ice melt, sea level rise, and many other climate phenomenon sort of affecting us globally every day. And that includes our nuclear weapons infrastructure. So it affects the stability of our military bases, around the world and the ability to deploy and use those and the risks associated with that. I know that Jamie has done a lot of work in that area, so I am going to let her do some of the deep dives into those particulars, because I think they are highly important as we think about how do we harden and protect and make more resilient our military infrastructure from the phenomenon of climate risks. Now, this program is focusing mostly on the risks to the nuclear weapons infrastructure, but you can think of all sorts of risks to energy, the energy infrastructure, civilian infrastructure, military bases, housing, every dimension of how we operate and have a ready force is affected by the changing climate. Now, I got it. So that's sort of a summary of me. And now in my capacity here, I chair the Council on Strategic Risks, which looks at all of these risks, led by Christine Parthmore, looks at nuclear, bio, climate, and biodiversity risks, among many others. And one of the important endeavors we've undertaken at the Council on Strategic Risks, and one of the first things we did in the Jan Nolan Center, same for Jan Nolan, who really led a lot of this work, is to launch a working group on climate and nuclear security. And that work, which Theo has been part of, and thank you, has then continued through now a new commission that we have, Commission on Nuclear Energy and Climate Security, composed of leaders across key sectors. I chair this along with Dan Poneman, the former Deputy Secretary of Energy, including military leaders, labor, environmental leaders, and many across all dimensions, so that we can look at the importance of, now let me put it this way. I'll just quote Jill Ruby, who is the head of the National Nuclear Security Administration, who at one of our convenings a few months ago said, humankind faces two existential threats for the first time in modern history. One is climate change, and the other, a holdover from the last century that isn't going away, is nuclear weapons. Both the solution to climate change and our nuclear deterrent involve the splitting of the atom, and in this way, they are tied together. Now, we know that the existential risks and threats of climate change require us to reform and transition our energy system away from fossil fuels, something that is not happening nearly as fast as the risks of climate change are mounting. And just in the last couple of days, there's been some new evidence that climate risks, and heat in particular, temperature as a barometer of the changing climate, pun intended, is increasing even faster than has been predicted. And so now we are already approaching the 1.5 degree C mark of temperature rise. That is the threshold against which we benchmark our progress at the Paris Agreement. And it's very clear, and as Theo noted, at COP28, there was a commitment to triple renewable energy, wind and solar, and also to triple nuclear energy by 2050. So both those commitments are essential if we're going to have any hope of sort of meeting our goals for a decarbonized future and coming maybe even close to the 2 degree C mark. I think it's inevitable that we will pass 1.5. So in the coming years, there's likely to be major growth in nuclear energy production around the world to meet growing electricity demands. And I'm going to just sort of summarize a little bit from the work of the commission and our mission now. And that's one of the observations, the growth in nuclear energy production. Then there's the role of the United States in that. And our view is that the US must assume a global leadership role on nuclear energy to ensure both that we can meet a decarbonized future and that the highest standards of safety, security, and non-proliferation are met. Today, state-owned Russian and Chinese companies are positioned to meet growth in demand for nuclear energy, while the United States, with our own history of leadership in safety and security, something that many of you at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists have been guardians of from your very inception, we've simultaneously fallen far behind other countries as an exporter of civil nuclear technology. So in order to resume our leadership position, the US needs to explore creative ways to shape global nuclear practices. And there's a lot more we can discuss, but I just want to hit this one point, Theo, you asked me about, which is the connection with the Sustainable Development Goals. So how do we grow? How do we increase capacity for nuclear energy with advanced nuclear reactors, small modular reactors, new safety technologies, and at the same time meet the Sustainable Development Goals? Well, I want to just sort of cite and make note that the Undersecretary of State for Non-Proliferation and International Security, Bonnie Jenkins, spoke directly to the connection between her work and the Sustainable Development Goals last year, and noted that the world needs clean, reliable, safe, and secure energy options to address the realities of climate change and move toward our shared net zero 2050 goals while meeting increasing energy requirements, and that civil nuclear energy is an important part of that mix. Advanced nuclear technologies such as small modular reactors can help make this transition to a green economy with greater diversification and reliability in energy sources. And then there are a number of programs that state and other parts of the US government have now, including the Exim Bank. We could get into some of that detail, but that's to say that aligns with developing sustainable goals and meeting some of the SDG goals, particularly the one that you cited. I think I will stop there and look forward to the discussion, Theo.
Thank you, Sherri. I think you covered a lot of ground there. I just want to give Jamie a chance to respond.
Great. Yeah, no, I mean, Sherri obviously has incredible experience, so I'm very excited to be on the panel with her, with you, Theo, and just to say my thanks as well to Hallie, Rachel, and the Bulletin team. As you said, Sherri covered a lot of great ground. You know, I think this notion of threat multiplier in particular, I want to pick up on. So without treading too much into Sherri's space, having helped coin the term, just to kind of reiterate the concept, essentially this notion of threat multiplier kind of considers how climate change presents not only its own environmental challenges with these vast and far-reaching consequences, but also exacerbates existing security challenges and risks. And Theo, I might be getting ahead of you and going back to that first framing point you made. But, you know, to take an example, let's think, for example, about how droughts might limit regional water supplies, right? And this major resource constraint could spark a larger conflict. That's not a good outcome, right? But it would be even worse if that conflict is sparked between two nuclear weapon states, right? There's concerns that that conflict could then escalate up to the nuclear level. So it's worth considering that. And it's also worth touching on another point Sherri made, considering how nuclear weapons programs themselves may be challenged by climate change, especially since force vulnerability is widely considered an escalation driver. And so Sherri very kindly referenced kind of the work I've been doing in this space. Last year, I released a study that looked specifically at climate change challenges to the US nuclear triad. And so to take an example, if we think about the SSBNs, the ballistic missile submarines that the US has, you know, it's bases these submarines in two different locations in the country, one of them being Kings Bay down in Georgia. There, you know, I kind of assessed how sea level rise and flooding could significantly affect the base's capacity to service and maintain these submarines, right? Under various climate change scenarios, we can see projections of rising waters inundating not just the waterfront facilities, which is perhaps a bit more intuitive, but also a key road that connects on the on-base missile facility to the waterfront. So we could see larger implications of these sea level rise impacts disrupting operations and submarine servicing. And of course, that impact is only worse if climate change effects prevented the submarines from entering port at any given time, with implications for crew exchanges and maintenance. And as I said, Kings Bay is one of only two bases equipped to support the SSBN mission, so this could have broader implications for the health and stealth of the fleet. Of course, these potential vulnerabilities to nuclear programs isn't isolated to the US, right? If we think about North Korea and Pakistan, these countries have recently experienced quite acute effects of climate change, like extreme flooding. Russia, we've seen wildfires historically threaten ICBMs. Wildfires are only likely to get worse with more extreme heat. And even the NATO DCA mission, right? We can think about the bases that host US nuclear weapons and operate these DCA in Europe. They themselves may be vulnerable to flash flooding, extreme heat, and wildfires that could affect their capacity to deliver the DCA mission. So all of these are just some examples that I'm happy to kind of go into more detail with, but really demonstrate how climate change really does challenge these programs, right? And in that sense, again, because increased force vulnerability is seen as an escalation driver, and we're seeing climate change increasing the vulnerability of these states' arsenals, there's this potential for exacerbating escalation risks. So it seems quite plausible that climate change can significantly affect not just nuclear policy, but also global nuclear dynamics.
Thank you, Jamie. Yeah, Sherri, do you want to respond to that? Or
Well, I appreciate very much that Jamie has done this deeper dive work into exactly the vulnerabilities and the risks associated with our nuclear infrastructure, because it's by doing these risk assessments of our infrastructure, whether it's nuclear or conventional weapons, or our base housing, or our ability to operate our ships or deploy our weapon system. It's by doing that risk assessment. In fact, the Defense Department has a huge program now. They do the defense climate assessment using the defense climate assessment tool to do those screening risk assessments. And it's by doing those risk assessments that you then develop, you then know how you to prioritize against those risks and what we need to fund in the defense budget in future years to make more resilient our infrastructure against those climate risks. And, so I'm pleased that you've done that. I think our allies and partners need to do that. And then if you kind of flip this equation on the other side, it's important also for us to understand the vulnerabilities of our adversaries' nuclear infrastructure to these risks. So, both things are true. We have to understand the risks, climate risks affecting the defense infrastructure and weapons facilities of our adversaries as well, so that we can be better prepared to reduce those risks.
thank you, Sherri. Yeah, I'd love to dive a bit deeper on this last point about how if climate change is causing nuclear force vulnerability, and as you both mentioned, force vulnerability can drive escalation. I mean, Jamie, could you just elaborate a little bit more on that concept and what might be at stake here? Especially given, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't seem very convincing to me that the collective we really knows how to control escalation or knows what to do if things start going, escalating from the conventional up to the nuclear level.
Right. Yeah. So this gets a lot into the nuclear policy space. So I'm glad you brought this up. But, essentially the concern is you can move through stages and cross different thresholds, right? You start with, let's say, a conventional conflict between one or two nuclear states that could involve some other players. There's some sort of escalatory threshold that is then crossed that we could see limited nuclear use that could potentially go up to a full out nuclear scale war, right? And the idea here is that because climate change is increasing force vulnerability, it could potentially change the kind of decision-making calculus of leaders in thinking about, if I'm concerned that, let's say, my submarine fleet is vulnerable because of sea level rise, or if I'm concerned that my bomber fleet is vulnerable because flash floods might shut down my runways and I'm not able to then launch these bombers when I want them to, that could then change how leaders are thinking about when they might deploy these systems. It could problematically impose pressures to deploy those systems faster. Let's say if there is a large scale hurricane approaching an SSBN base, you have some SSBNs there that are undergoing maintenance, something like that. There's different contingencies that, again, as Sherri said, I think it's quite useful to think through and do some of this worst case scenario planning in considering how these impacts could inform these decisions that are made, especially in the heat of conflict. One of the kind of perhaps a bit more out there considerations as well, but something worth thinking about is what happens if there's a climate disaster, right? Could an opportunistic adversary kind of take advantage of that and the vulnerability that might pose to probably a specific base, not an entire weapons program as a whole, but something worth considering as part of those worst case scenario plans.
Mm-hmm. Great. Sherri, do you have any more comments on that point, or should we move on to the next?
Well, I just to bring those considerations back to something I think is already we're experiencing today, which is in the Arctic, which is experiencing more rapid climate change than anywhere else on the planet, with temperatures rising and sea ice retreating. We now have Russia has really taken under Putin, really trying to both militarize and commercialize its Arctic resources. Russia is a very large Arctic nation, has a lot of its 20% of its GDP comes from mining and energy and other industrial activities in the Arctic. So as Putin in the climate era increases commercial development there and militarizes and nuclearizes its operations in the Arctic, building more and more nuclear icebreakers, floating nuclear power plants, and increasing its nuclear infrastructure there, the risks rise. To me, the thing that keeps me up at night about that is not so much the deliberate launch of a nuclear weapon by Russia, but an accident. An accident because we know historically that Russia's nuclear practices, from Chernobyl to the Kursk submarine, don't meet the standards we consider appropriate for modern safety and security of nuclear technology and nuclear. And so the risks rise as the numbers increase and as operations across the region increase. Putin has a goal of sort of converting the northern sea route along the Russian coastline into a toll road for transit. And it wants nuclear-powered icebreakers to escort those vessels, potentially from China and other places, coming from Asia to ports in Europe. So that increases the risk of an accident in future years that could result either in an oil spill in the Arctic, a need for a search and rescue mission, and you don't know what kind of fuel and how those vessels will be powered and what kind of risks those could pose. At the end of the Cold War, I was directly involved with helping to denuclearize parts of the former Soviet Union. When I served in the Department of Defense, we had the large cooperative threat reduction program going on, led by my boss and Bill Perry, Secretary Perry, and I led a program called Arctic Military Environmental Cooperation with Russia and Norway, which was all about reducing the risks of liquid waste streams from Russian nuclear submarines that had sunk in pierside in Murmansk and in the Kola Peninsula, that the Norwegians were particularly worried was going to harm their fishing fleet, their fishing grounds, because that region of Russia, the Murmansk Kola Peninsula, is very close to Norway's prized fishing areas. And so we built a cask with the Russians in the 90s to safely offload the liquid waste streams from decommissioned nuclear submarines so that it could be stored safely inland rather than left to rot at sea. So those are the types of risks, the contaminant risks in some ways, that we also need to be mindful of.
Great, thank you. It seems as though to me that in a world of growing geopolitical tensions and crises in many different areas, sort of the last thing we need is to have the role of climate change making all of this much more complicated. But it seems this is where we are. So I'm hoping that we can shift the conversation a little bit back to this concept of dramatic expansion of nuclear power around the world to decarbonize the global energy system. What I don't want to do is use this time to sort of litigate the merits or demerits of nuclear power. Instead, I just want to sort of start with the principle where there are, like we said, 24 countries planning this dramatic nuclear expansion across multiple continents. My view is that this shouldn't be left to governments alone. We need expertise. We need the nuclear policy community involved to sort of envision and anticipate the consequences of a more nuclearized world. And so maybe, Sherri, you could elaborate a bit on some of your comments earlier about what is sort of at the top of policymakers' agendas in terms of this plan to sort of dramatically expand nuclear power.
Well, okay, thank you, Theo. So there is, as I mentioned, at COP28, many countries, more than 70 countries, committed to tripling nuclear energy, as well as renewable energy by 2050. And avoiding the worst outcomes of the climate crisis does depend on accelerating our transition to clean energy. So, and as the International Atomic Energy Agency has said, and they've developed a net zero emissions scenario in which nuclear energy's output would need to rise by 40% by 2030 and at least double by 2050. I don't know that it's realistic to there doesn't seem to be a path to get there on that. And if the US is not part of it, part of growing civilian nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, then to me, the risks are going to rise even greater, because if we're not leading with our allies and partners, then it's going to be Russia and China. So, you know, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, says that these goals require roughly 5 times the current rate of growth. So that's, you know, that's very significant. And so, you know, the US was once a dominant supplier of nuclear technology exports, going back to the Atoms for Peace program under President Eisenhower. But in the last decade or so, you know, we've kind of fallen behind in our competitiveness. And, you know, stemming even from predating the Putin's invasion of Ukraine, you know, Russia's become the dominant global supplier for nuclear reactors, and dominates the global nuclear fuel market, which again, I think it's not in our national interest, and it's not in the interest of nuclear safety and security. So, fortunately, the US just last year opened the first uranium enrichment plant in decades. And so that is promising, and it's important. But it's important that the US sort of be back in this back on the global nuclear supply chain. So, you know, there are existing large baseload reactors, light water reactors, other types of reactors, but there's a whole new generation of small modular advanced reactors, microreactors under development that offer sort of next generation safety and security. So much of that is underway. And that's important to continue as well. Those plants, the small modular and micro reactors, may offer opportunities to meet power in remote locations. They have opportunities to sort of serve other areas that are currently in energy poverty as they lift up, so they become less reliant across parts of the world on Africa, let's say in parts of Africa, on building out the fossil fuel infrastructure that we now need to transition away from in order to achieve our climate goals. And so the US under, you know, particularly in this administration, but starting even before that, has really made commitments to advance the global nuclear supply chain, next generation reactors. And so this is increasingly important. We need to sort of meet all of the dimensions of it: nuclear safety, security, non-proliferation, also advanced technologies. We need to work with our allies and partners. There are important programs through the Exim Bank now. I serve on their climate council, and in the last year or so, Chair Rita Lewis has signed agreements both with Poland and with Bulgaria. And it's important, just as an example, you know, we had been, you know, Russia's now developing deals with Turkey on nuclear energy, and that is not necessarily in our interest. And so we need to figure out, you know, very strategically how it aligns, how our views align with our allies and partners, and be able to show leadership in that area and to address their issues. So now, and then we have to work this on a number of fronts, both on the commercial side and also through the non-proliferation side. And so there are efforts occurring across many different dimensions, including through, let's say, our new agreements in the Indo-Pacific with AUKUS, the Trilateral Partnership. We're transferring defense and nuclear technology there. There are opportunities there to increase focus on civilian nuclear cooperation with our allies and partners in that region, and with Japan as it considers rekindling, you know, a greater role for nuclear energy, to think about how it's going to have a decarbonized future, a country that, for example, very highly dependent on fossil fuels right now, and will need a diversified energy source as it seeks to transition.
Thank you, Sherri. And again, that's very helpful. It feels to me that this conversation is so wide-ranging that we could go in a number of different directions. But I just want to give Jamie a chance to comment on anything that we've said before, or make any emphasize any of your points before we move over to audience Q&A.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on Sherri's great point about, the non-proliferation concerns that the expansion of civil nuclear technology raises. And I think that's a useful chance to kind of include this discussion in the NPT context, right? So the non-proliferation treaty, of course, access to peaceful uses is really enshrined in the treaty, right? It's at the heart of the grand bargain. But of course, as part of that, the NPT has helped to establish this huge and quite expansive set of safeguards and security kind of really enshrined in the IAEA, of course, to ensure that these civil nuclear programs are not a cover or are not contributing to or diverting to a weapons program, of course, right? And so those are some of the considerations that I think add some important context to Sherri's great comments. Of course, and we talked about this earlier in the week, Theo, that leads to a conversation on enrichment and reprocessing, whether states have a right to ENR or if ENR poses too big of a proliferation risks. So these are some of the questions that, as you say, I think both governments, but also folks outside of government, civil society, and also commercial actors really need to be thinking through amidst this expansion. And just to add one more point, if I can, before we shift over, talking about the NPT space and shifting back to the SDG conversation as well. When we think about climate change in the NPT context, it's often brought up in and framed around the SDGs, where peaceful nuclear applications, not just for addressing energy poverty, but also things like medical and agricultural applications, can promote health outcomes and address food insecurity that are really kind of at the heart of some of these SDGs. And I think there's still a lot of education to be done on these types of applications and their potential benefits, but quite importantly, also the safety, security, or even non-proliferation considerations that really need to be paired with any application of nuclear technology. So as you say, lots to talk about. So there's some more things to throw at the wall.
Thanks, Jamie. I guess I'll just before we move over to invite Hallie up onto the screen, I just want to say, I think from my experience, it's common for nuclear and climate experts to oppose nuclear energy on safety or security grounds. And for many reasons, it's tough to blame them. But in my view, I think the main question is, how do we achieve our decarbonization goals? I mean, if we're opposing nuclear power with no larger plan to actually decarbonize the global economy, then what we're doing really is missing the bigger picture. So I think that the right framing, in my view, is to anticipate and manage the consequences of a more nuclearized world. And that's a tall order, and we've touched on a bunch of the challenges that presents. But if it seems to me that there's a great deal of evidence that there's a nuclear necessity for the climate, whether many of us like it or not. And so that's where we are. And so with that, I think what we'll do is we'll open it up to Q&A. And so I'd love to invite Hallie back onto the screen. There you go, Hallie. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much, Theo. Hello again, all. As a reminder, my name is Hallie Posner. I'm the Assistant Director of Programs here at the Bulletin. If you have a question for our speakers or moderator, please put it in the Q&A function, which can be found at the bottom of your screen. So our speakers can see these questions and make sure you're in the queue. And when I will call on you to ask a question, you will receive a prompt on your screen to unmute yourself. Please accept that prompt, then ask one question. Please know that we do see all questions in the Q&A function. If we are unable to call on you, it's because someone is ahead of you in the queue. As a reminder, a recording of this program will be available on our website in the coming days. Now let's move on to our first question. Let's go to Kareem Kamel first. Kareem, I'm sending you a prompt. Can you unmute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Right. I wanted to ask about what role could civil society play in facilitating engagements between the climate change and the nuclear security sector? And the more specific, the better. So specific policy recommendations, initiatives, what sort of particular modeling needs to be conducted to carve out the most efficient and secure way to manage a surge in nuclear energy as announced by these countries during the COP meeting? And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kareem. So as I understand the question, what's the role of civil society in bringing about this more nuclearized world? I mean, in a, tripling nuclear capacity is going to, seems to me, it'll create, new reactor types, potentially new enrichment and reprocessing facilities, material accumulation challenges. And again, it's not something that we can leave to governments alone. My perspective is one from a grant maker and philanthropy, and I could say from experience that this is extremely under-examined. We need more productive engagement on the future of nuclear energy for the climate. But that's just my 2 cents. I'd love to hand it over to Jamie or Sherri to try to address this too. But I think we're likely to be strong believers in the role of civil society in navigating these policy challenges.
I guess I'd like to start on that, Theo, and Kareem, just observing that civil society has a really important role to play. And at COP, there were many civil society organizations there, including a number of, a lot of youth, all wearing their T-shirts saying, let's talk about nuclear, nuclear, the next gen nuclear, these are next gen nuclear, engaged citizens, professionals who are working on nuclear energy. And there were many organizations at COP. There was a whole net zero nuclear day. I mean, there was climate had sort of every dimension at COP, from gender to migration to foreign policy and national security and every type of energy. And on the nuclear side, there was a lot of effort on focus on net zero nuclear, advanced technologies. And I think civil society has certainly an important role to play in sort of reframing how we communicate about nuclear, because I can see from the chat that, there's still a lot of concerns people have about nuclear, that it seems frightening to some people. So how do we communicate it in a way that makes sense? How do people understand that the next generation of nuclear technology can offer greater safety and security benefits and can provide us cleaner energy? So I think that's, but it goes well beyond the communications. It's in every piece of the sort of energy infrastructure puzzle, to sort of how to transition and transmission, to education, to technical solutions. So I think that there are important roles to play, and you see many organizations now, new ones coming in and existing ones kind of reforming the work they do to be able to rise to this challenge.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think civil society can play 2 specific roles as part of that effort. Civil society can do a lot of the translating work. A lot of these climate experts and nuclear experts aren't necessarily speaking in the same language, or especially along the same timescales. And I think some of that is changing, particularly, as Sherri mentioned, in the COP28 context of thinking about kind of nuclear energy as a transition. But on the weapons side of things, for example, these timescales look quite different. And then secondly, I think civil society can be kind of a gatherer or play a convening role, if you will, right? Making sure the right players are talking to one another. And that's, your traditional governments and things, but also industry, right? Industry is going to be playing a key role in this transition to civil nuclear technology. And so making sure that, industry folks are talking to policymakers who are trying to ensure that these proliferation frameworks are the non-proliferation frameworks, I should say, are capturing this expansion of nuclear energy. So making sure civil society can really kind of make sure that those folks are all speaking to one another and understanding concerns on both sides.
Great.
Thank you.
Sorry, Theo.
No, please go ahead, Holly.
Next, we'll take our next question. I'm Elizabeth Rashlau. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we do.
Okay, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. And as I wrote, I am from Sweden, so it is in Europe, and the discussion is very different now. Of course, Sweden is a good nuclear energy country. And right now, politics wants to expand, and there is some agreement with France, which is also a country of good nuclear power. but the discussions about SMR is very, very on a non-knowledgeable basis, I would say. And we still have, say, all the problems with the waste from the nuclear power. And the SMR is the same techniques as we have in the nuclear power today. So it will create just as much nuclear waste as we have with the nuclear powers today. And then when you talk about the danger of proliferation, then I would really like that there was more focus on saying that danger, like Hans Blix have shown many, many times, that danger is not very large, that there is so much required from if a country is ready for nuclear power until a country is ready for nuclear weapons. So that part I would really like you to emphasize and talk a little bit about. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Sherri, do you want to take that one on?
Okay, sure. Thank you very much for that question and for sharing your experience from Sweden, an important ally and partner, and soon to be new member of NATO. You're very important to global security and security in the High North, a long, great tradition. Very fond of your country. Now on nuclear technology, I would say first of it's important. There's new nuclear fuel types being developed today that are for all types of reactors, whether it's existing larger light water reactors or the new more advanced small modular reactors, is safer. So there is safer with less waste, and that's important. We are, the world hasn't stood still, even though the U.S. has lost ground in some of its global leadership, but the technology development has continued and advanced. And that's why, in part, I think there's very strong bipartisan support in the United States now for advancing the next generation of nuclear. And I would also note that, the U.S. is now supporting nuclear newcomer countries in capacity building in a manner that is consistent with the International Atomic Energy Agency milestones approach for implementing responsible nuclear energy program. And there's a program run out of the State Department by Undersecretary of State Bonnie Jenkins and her colleagues there, who I give a shout out to, called the Foundational Infrastructure for Responsible Use of Small Modular Reactor Technology. Big mouthful, but they goes by FIRST. And the U.S., while maintaining the highest standards of nuclear security, safety, and non-proliferation, SMRs are meaningful investments in long-term economic growth, including enabling advanced industrial development and generating jobs. And the U.S. has had over 125 first capacity building engagements in the last several years and trained, this goes also back to the other question on civil society, trained over 1,750 nuclear experts and officials on workshops, webinars, technical consultancy, study tours. And there are other programs also on net zero. There's one called We Can, Winning an Edge Through Cooperation on Advanced Nuclear, to deepen the support and deployment of advanced, safe, and secure nuclear reactor technologies in responsible third countries and work toward net zero emissions goals. And then there's another super exciting program that I really like called Project Phoenix, also led through the State Department, which is accelerating global clean energy transition by supporting feasibility studies and providing technical assistance to support the conversion of coal-fired power plants. Okay, those are among the worst of our energy polluters, to reliable and safe net zero SMR nuclear energy generation. So those are some of the important initiatives that, most of which could benefit from being scaled up greatly to regain U.S. nuclear leadership in this space.
Thank you, Sherri. And just to add to that, I would say that there's no doubt that nuclear energy and the expansion thereof poses a series of challenges, but climate change is a defining global challenge of our time. And the question is, how do we decarbonize? So we can criticize nuclear power and the various shortcomings that it has until we're blue in the face, but opposing it with no larger plan to decarbonize is just irresponsible, in my opinion. And so I think we need policy development. We need silo busting engagement among climate experts, nuclear policy experts, et cetera, to sort of make progress here. But Jamie, do you have any more to add on that point before we move to the final question?
Well, just to say, I really like that phrase, silo busting engagement. I might steal that a little bit, if that's all right with you. But just on your great second question in terms of the proliferation dangers as well, I think you touched on that. So certainly the concern about diversion to nuclear weapons is very much on one side of the scale, right? As you suggested, not all states that have civil nuclear programs could do that, let alone would want to. Most do not, to be clear. But on the other side of that, I think it's really important to ensure that these safety and security and safeguards considerations are put in place, also to ensure, the protection of the workers at these facilities, of the local community, to ensure there aren't, steps taken that might endanger surrounding communities through spills or things like that. So making sure that these measures are put in place is quite important. And so ensuring, again, that kind of non-proliferation framework is in place to support this civil nuclear expansion to address some of these climate change concerns, the decarbonization concern Theo has raised. And so I think that's quite an important aspect of this expansion. Again, not all of it is concerned that there might be a diversion to nuclear weapons use, but it certainly is part of the conversation to be thinking about these safety and security measures and the safeguard system that is really, rooted in IAEA inspections, that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Jamie. Hallie?
Sure. So now we will go to Gary Jones for our last question. Gary, can you unmute yourself to ask? Gary, can you unmute yourself?
Okay.
There you are. Hello.
Yes.
Perfect.
My question is, do you think we need to revisit the approach that we have of expanding nuclear power to different countries, based on the fact that, I think the difficulties, I'm not talking about proliferation, but I'm talking about just operating, the issues of waste disposal, the issue of cost, those issues. Do you think we need to revisit where we intend to expand nuclear energy?
Thanks, Gary. Sherri or Jamie, would you like to respond to that?
Well, I think we do that with each particular engagement in which we enter into. We assess, the political, strategic, and other risks associated with that country, both, from the safety, security, non-proliferation standpoint, but also, again, flip it around, as I said early on, if the U.S. is not going to be the nuclear supplier, okay, maybe it's France, but maybe it's Russia, maybe it's China. Mm-hmm. And is that going to provide us more safety, more security, less nuclear proliferation? And I think that's, so we have to ask ourselves those questions as well. So it's important, these are tough areas because you've got these set of converging risks and compounding risks, and we have to be able to walk and chew gum. And so we have to be able to do both. And that's why I think some of these programs, the ones I just mentioned, particularly through the State Department with the Department of Energy and other agencies and through the Exim Bank, is really looking at building out sort of the safety, non-proliferation, and security infrastructure associated with the next gen technology, so that we have those trained individuals who can operate in a safe and secure environment. Of course, everything is also assessing and balancing risks. We are unfortunately not leaving our children a risk-free world. So we have to, do the best we can while we're able to leave a better world for our children and our grandchildren.
Thank you, Sherri. So that was a beautiful sort of summation, but I wanted to invite Jamie, do you have any sort of concluding remarks you want to sum up? Again, we've covered a lot of ground here, so we can go in many different directions, but please.
Yeah, so just to shift back a little bit to some of the research I conducted and to one of Sherri's points, I think what's really key from this conversation, especially on the convergence of climate change and the nuclear weapons side of things, is we really need to be conducting climate change vulnerability assessments. I don't think there is enough of that work out there. I touched the surface a little bit in the US, of course. We need to dive much deeper, folks in DoD, in NNSA, on that side of things, needs to be thinking about this using some of their more classified knowledge and such. We also need to be thinking about this in other contexts, right? Allies need to be thinking about this, adversaries need to be thinking about this. I think this inevitably is going to be a convergence that we're going to continue to see throughout the century. And as part of that, there's all these recommendations I could say of investing in dynamic climate change modeling, as part of these broader efforts that, Sherri mentioned, for example, the DoD climate assessment tool, as part of these broader efforts that folks might be taking in the climate security space, ensuring that there's a mission level attention as well. In this case, the nuclear weapons deterrent side of things, just to ensure that, we really are focused on this particularly concerning convergence of climate and nuclear as Theo kind of laid out at the start. So I think maybe I'll go ahead and stop there just with another thank you to the Bulletin organizers, to Theo, and of course to Sherri for such a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamie. And I think I'll just pass the mic back to Sherri, or offer the microphone to you one more time before we have Hallie close us out. Just want to make sure you have a chance to put a bow on things if you like.
I just want to thank you, Theo, for leading a good discussion and for your commitment and your the work that you've been doing in this field to really elevate attention both to growing climate and nuclear risk, but also to the opportunities for the future. And I think that's incredibly important. This is a very educated audience we have here, and these are really important discussions. So I want to thank you for doing that, and for Jamie for your taking this on in your professional space, and Haley and Rachel in particular, and the team here, because I think these are the most existential risks we face, right? From I started in this field because I want to address being the child of Holocaust refugees. I felt I really had to devote my life to working on the greatest threats of the era, and during the Cold War, it was nuclear weapons. And now that's and now we've added climate change to that mix. So these are tough challenges. The particulars do matter, and I'm glad that the Bulletin is paying attention to it, and that we can lead our way into a safer and cleaner future that reduces both those risks.
Thanks a lot, Sherri. That's very kind. And I think I'll pass it back to Hallie. And just with a final comment, just to say, hopefully this conversation about the climate nuclear nexus is something of a reinvigoration or a new beginning of more conversations about this, because clearly there are many challenges to work on at this nexus. And thank you very much to the Bulletin again for a great conversation. Hallie?
Thanks so much. I'll just offer one more round of thanks to our speakers, to Sherri and Jamie for this dynamic conversation, and to Theo for shepherding us through it. And last but not least, thank you to everyone in the audience for participating with us and supporting the Bulletin for this last hour. We are adjourned. Thank you.